In 1974, a married father of two disappeared without a trace while trying to retrieve his dog from a garden during a lightning storm. Despite the efforts of his family, friends, and even the police, he was nowhere to be found. 3 days later, he was discovered lying in the same garden, dressed in different clothes and with no memory of how he got there. Slowly, however, fragments of his experience started to return, and as he pieced together what had happened during those 3 days, an even larger mystery emerged, one that could suggest the multiverse is real. It was Sunday, July 28, 1974. Peter Williamson, his wife Mary, and their 2 children hosted a barbecue at their home in Somerset, England, inviting a group of friends. The day had been unusually warm and humid, and as guests began arriving, the sky took on a deep, ominous shade of black. Thunder rumbled overhead as drinks were served under the covered patio, and people chatted before sitting down to eat. No one seemed overly concerned about the shifting weather until the rain started pouring down with force. The children soon noticed that the family's dog, Scruff, was cowering under a bush on the far side of the lawn. Peter decided to run over, pick up the frightened animal, and bring him inside. As his family and guests watched, Peter sprinted across the lawn. Before he even reached the halfway point, a massive lightning bolt forked down from the sky, striking a tree in the neighbor's yard and silhouetting him in its glow. Then, without a sound, Peter suddenly and inexplicably vanished. His wife and children screamed, while their guests gasped in disbelief. Peter wasn't lying in the grass. He wasn't sheltering with the dog. He was simply gone. No one could fully process what they had just witnessed. Ignoring the danger, family and friends rushed into the yard, frantically searching for him. They scoured every inch of the high-walled garden, but he was nowhere to be found. The police were called and quickly arrived at the scene. They questioned the guests and carried out their own extensive search, covering the entire property and even checking the neighbors' yards. Yet, there was no sign of Peter anywhere. Mary was eventually given a sedative, and a friend took the children for the night. 2 other friends stayed behind, taking turns keeping watch in case Peter returned and needed help. The police assured them there was a logical explanation for what had happened. They suggested that the lightning strike had triggered some kind of trauma, leading to amnesia or disorientation. According to their theory, the bright flash had temporarily blinded the witnesses, creating the illusion that Peter had disappeared instantly. In reality, they argued, a minute or 2 had passed unnoticed, during which time Peter had simply walked away. Some of the guests were willing to accept this explanation, even though the entire garden was enclosed by a tall wall, with the only entrance, a door near the garage, locked by Mary because the latch was broken and would rattle at the slightest breeze. Additionally, the wall was too high to climb without a ladder or similar tool, and there were no footprints or indentations in the flower beds beneath it to indicate that Peter had scaled it. The time between the flash and his disappearance wasn't a matter of minutes, as the police suggested, but an instant. The guests would have undoubtedly noticed him climbing the wall if that had been the case. Even the police struggled to explain how he had actually vanished. It was a mystery to everyone. 2 days passed without any sign or word from Peter. Some locals speculated about what might have happened, while his wife, Mary, was overwhelmed with worry, unsure if she would ever see him again. Then, without warning, early on the 3rd morning, the Williamsons' gardener found Peter lying semi-conscious in some shrubbery at the far end of the garden. One of his feet was dangling in a small pool, yet he was otherwise completely dry. The gardener, speaking to author Colin Parsons, was adamant about this detail, that Peter's clothes were entirely dry, and there was no sign of dewfall. This suggested he hadn't been in the garden overnight. Strangely, he had no key, yet he had somehow gotten inside. The police assumed he must have entered from the road, though there were no signs of forced entry. He appeared physically unharmed, but he was dressed somewhat differently from when he had disappeared. The gardener immediately informed Mary, who, along with a doctor friend who had come over, rushed Peter to the general hospital. Doctors determined that aside from being in a state of shock, he was suffering from amnesia. He had no memory of what had happened during the 3 days he was missing. Peter remained in the hospital for a week before going home to fully recover, but even then, his memory of those 3 days remained a complete blank. Even after returning home, when his wife and friends tried to walk him through the events of that day, he recalled nothing. However, over time, the missing 60 hours began returning to him in fragmented, vivid dreams. These dreams came almost every night, and each morning he could remember them in striking detail. This continued for 3 weeks. Sometimes the dreams were unclear, sometimes repetitive, but they seemed to form a sequence, gradually piecing together events that had previously been lost to him. In his dreams, Peter found himself drenched in the middle of a garden, with no recollection of what had happened before. He could remember coming to, standing near some flower beds beside a small road. Feeling uneasy, he wandered down the road, torn between wanting to tell someone what had happened and fearing what he might discover. He walked for a long time as the evening light faded, eventually feeling weak and sitting by the roadside. Before long, a passing motorist, who happened to be a doctor, stopped and helped him. Peter recalled telling the man that he had no memory of how he ended up there. The doctor took him to a hospital, where he was admitted, though he was unable to provide his name or address. Wearing only a t-shirt and jeans, with nothing on him that could confirm his identity, Peter was placed in a bed, and the police were called. Unable to provide any useful information, he watched as they left, saying they would check their missing persons records. In his dreams, Peter remembered that the ward he had been placed in was called Pritchard. The doctor's name was Nugent, and the ward sister was Alice Charles. One strange and almost surreal memory from his hospital stay was the feeling that he was experiencing hallucinations. At times, the usual scenes of the ward seemed to ripple, and for brief moments, the faces and furniture around him would appear entirely different. These visions were fleeting, but he mentioned them to the doctor, who examined him for signs of a concussion, believing that a fall or a blow to the head might have caused his amnesia. Nothing unusual was found. Another thing Peter recalled was that although he felt like he was speaking normally, his words seemed stretched out compared to the crisp speech of the doctors and nurses. In his own words, it was almost like slow motion. On his second day at the hospital, feeling a bit stronger, he asked the nurse in charge if he could take a short walk, hoping that fresh air might help jog his memory. He requested the clothes he had been wearing when he arrived. He knew he had a white t-shirt, a pair of blue jeans, underwear, socks, and shoes. The nurse brought everything except his jeans. He was told they were too damaged to be kept and had been burned. Fortunately, a Cornish man in the next bed, whom Peter had been sharing the room with, offered to lend him a pair of brown corduroy trousers. Since they were of similar build, Peter accepted the offer. He put on his own clothes, along with the borrowed cords, which fit him well. Stepping outside, Peter started exploring the hospital grounds. The last memory of the dream was walking across the turf, toward the same garden where he had first appeared. Peter shared these dreams with his wife, describing how real they felt, as if he had actually lived them rather than just imagined them. He began to wonder if they were truly memories of what had really happened to him during those missing 3 days. He considered the possibility that he had actually made it through the fence and had been taken to a hospital. Nothing about the events of that day contradicted this idea, making it seem like a logical explanation. That settled things in his mind, and he didn't think much more about it, until one Sunday in August, when his son asked him to take him to a nearby motorcycle rally. Recalling that the track was usually muddy, Peter went to his closet in search of something old to wear. He started looking for his jeans, and that's when it hit him. Those jeans had been burned in his dream. He hadn't been wearing them when he woke up in the garden, which meant he wouldn't have them now. Then he came across the brown corduroy trousers, the ones loaned to him by his fellow patient in the dream. They were hanging in his wardrobe, placed there by his wife. She had brought him a suit when he left the hospital, and must have had the trousers cleaned without a second thought. In all the chaos of coming home, he had completely forgotten about them. Peter realized that if he could track down the owner, he might not only return the trousers but also find out where the small hospital was located. The thought of going back to thank the staff and let them know he was okay excited him. Inside the trousers, he found a label from a tailor named Herbert Fox, based in a well-known West Country town. There was also a set of monogrammed initials, JB, sewn into the label, similar to how the older generation used to mark their clothing, like a high-end laundry tag. Peter attempted to find the tailor's contact information through directory inquiries, but the name was unlisted. Now that he had a lead, he decided to drive to the town himself and get the answers in person. It was a 100-mile trip, but he felt it was worth it if it meant uncovering what had happened during those missing days. Upon arriving, he quickly learned that no such shop currently existed. Desperate for more information, he reached out to the local Chamber of Trade and was told that the shop had once been there, but had burned down in the 1950s and was never reopened. Completely baffled, Peter returned home. The trousers were new, with a modern style, so he knew they couldn't possibly have come from the 1950s, no matter how well they had been preserved. Peter needed to get to the bottom of it, so he asked if there were any towns in the Commonwealth or the U.S. with that name. But he came up empty. Since no answers were coming, he decided to put it out of his mind. Until a chance meeting with a friend who lived a couple of miles away brought everything back into focus. The friend mentioned that he had recently been in the hospital for a minor operation. He also brought up a doctor, Nugent. This caught Peter's attention immediately, and he asked which hospital the surgery had taken place in. The answer surprised him. It was at the cottage hospital in his own town, less than a mile from where he lived. Peter had never known of its existence, having always gone to the general hospital for checkups. Once he learned this, things started to fall into place. This had to be where the motorist had taken him that morning. Without wasting time, Peter drove to the small hospital, which was tucked away on the outskirts of town. He was sure it was the right place, even before arriving. The landmarks looked familiar, and he recognized the road from his final walk away from the building. Inside, his dream became real. Everything was exactly as he remembered. As soon as he stepped through the doors, he recognized the hallways, the desks, and even some of the posters on the walls. He had definitely been there before. He approached reception and asked for Dr. Nugent. After being asked to wait, Nugent appeared within minutes. Peter recognized him instantly and jumped to his feet to greet him. But oddly, Dr. Nugent did not return his welcoming smile. There was no recognition in his eyes. He didn't seem to know him at all, and Peter was forced to introduce himself. He gave a brief summary of what had happened, the amnesia, Nurse Alice Charles, the pants, and everything else. "I'm afraid you have the wrong hospital. I've never seen you before, and I haven't had an amnesia case in 5 years," Nugent told him. Peter was stunned. How could this be? Sensing Peter's distress, Nugent led him to the hospital's small cafe, where they sat down to talk. The doctor explained that amnesia cases often had unusual side effects, and that a simple chance remark overheard in a vulnerable state could create a completely imaginary scenario. He mentioned that he occasionally worked at the General Hospital and might have been discussed on the wards. When asked how Peter knew about Sister Charles, the doctor responded, "She accompanies me sometimes." However, he could not explain why Peter was so familiar with both the exterior and interior of the cottage hospital, unless he had actually been there before and simply forgotten about it. As for the brand-new brown corduroy trousers that showed no signs of fading, the doctor assumed they had been loaned to Peter by a patient at the General Hospital, despite the fact that similar trousers had not been available for nearly 20 years. He believed Peter had simply misread the label. Nothing more. Regarding how Peter recognized him without an introduction, and how he knew the exact amount of change needed for 2 cups of tea before entering the cafe, the doctor dismissed them as lucky guesses and fragments of memory. Peter returned home feeling even more uncertain. He was convinced he had been taken to the cottage hospital. He was sure he had been treated by Dr. Nugent and Nurse Alice Charles. He remembered staying in Pritchard Ward, sharing a room with a Cornish man who lent him a new and expensive pair of trousers. He recalled walking around the hospital grounds, breathing in the fresh air, and enjoying tea. He was certain these were real memories, not dreams. Yet no one at that hospital could remember him, and there were no records of a patient with amnesia being admitted there or at the General Hospital during that time. Nothing made sense. Peter Williamson's unusual case caught the attention of author and researcher Colin Parsons, who traveled to the Williamsons' home in Somerset and stayed with them for a weekend. He carefully went over every detail with the family and friends who were present that day. One witness, Parsons noted, actually saw the event reflected in the living room window, disproving the police's suggestion that Peter had experienced temporary blindness. Parsons was given permission to take the trousers for further examination. His findings were published in his 1990 book, Encounters with the Unknown: True Accounts of Modern Paranormal Experiences. All tailoring marks are publicly documented, and it was confirmed that the mark on the corduroy slacks was authentic. When I requested information about the fabric itself, it was confirmed to be of recent manufacture. Interestingly, the zipper was identified as a newer model, introduced only in 1968, 14 years after the tailoring shop had burned down. The only possible explanation left, though an unlikely one, was that an old label had been sewn into a newly made pair of trousers. Keeping a label spotless for 14 years seemed like an unlikely task, but I felt it was important to consider every possibility, no matter how remote. When I contacted the manufacturer, their response was unexpected. They confirmed that the label had been stitched onto the trousers using their traditional method and that the stitching had not been altered. They also asked for the address of the tailor listed on the label, as they had been unable to reach him themselves. Interestingly, they noted that the color of the trousers was not an exact match with their corduroys, and asked if I knew what dye had been used to achieve the subtle green tint. They were interested in incorporating it into future production. When Peter returned, his pockets contained a pack of senior service cigarettes, with 2 remaining. He had obtained these in the other place. Parsons examined their coating and found it to be normal for that time and region. Also in his possession was a silk handkerchief monogrammed with JB and 27 pounds in change, equivalent to about $42 in American money. Peter recalled that a nurse had given him some money when he first acquired the trousers, and that he had some loose silver from the tea he had purchased at a cafe. Parsons noted that the money was indistinguishable from regular currency. Given the unusual nature of his case, how Peter seemed to disappear in front of stunned witnesses, only to reappear in a hospital where no staff remembered treating him, Parsons began to believe that Peter had somehow slipped from this reality into another. This parallel world appeared nearly identical to his own, yet with subtle differences. Peter recalled the hospital ward shimmering, as if the two universes were still shifting around him. His slower speech suggested an energy difference between dimensions. Rodney Davies explored this case further in his 1996 book, Supernatural Vanishings, Otherworldly Disappearances. He suggested that Peter had momentarily left our world in an instant and entered another dimension that was nearly identical. In that world, everything continued as it does here, with duplicates of people and places. However, perfect synchronization was impossible. For example, the corduroy trousers. Manufacturer that had shut down in 1954 in Peter's world was still in business in the other world's 1974. Even more unsettling was the possibility that when Peter entered that world, his counterpart did not immediately disappear. For a brief period, there may have been two Peter Williamsons in that dimension. If Peter had retained his memory, he might have gone to his home there, only to come face to face with himself. So what are your thoughts on this mystery? Tell us in the comments below and subscribe for more content.